let me tell you something. You ain't heard nothing yet. Please introduce the one, the only, Dr. Peter McCullough.
Thank you so much, and thanks to each and every one of you for attending. This is a spectacular venue, and I've learned not to underestimate the wisdom pearl and the SDA, because I can tell you the engagement and the interest in both spiritual growth and our personal health is impressive, very impressive. I'm an internist and cardiologist, and my topic was to tackle chronic disease, or these problems that we accrue over time. And our U.S. Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, says that if we were to do any type of intervention, it should help us feel better, function better, or survive longer. Feel, function, or survive. That would be the reason why we would do anything. And a recent paper published in the Journal of the American Medical Association discussed the idea of a health span and a lifespan. And the two are different. The health span is the duration of time that you have where you are healthy and able to do the things that you want to do. Come here, go there, accomplish everything you want to accomplish. Your lifespan is this total duration that you live. The conclusion of the paper was that the difference between the end of the health span and the end of the lifespan is about 10 years, a decade. And all of you know this. All of you know someone or have had a close relative, maybe your father or your mother, your grandmother, your grandfather, and you're in that zone. I know I am, because I just traveled here from Dallas with my wife and her mother, who's 92. And I thought about her on the plane. Is she still in the health span, or are we beyond the health span and living out the lifespan? And I've thankfully concluded that she's still within her health span at 92. Wouldn't it be wonderful if we could all do that? Right? Well, we've come a long way. Many of you have heard the new moniker, Make America Healthy Again, MAHA. How many of you have heard that? MAHA, right? So it kind of resonates, right? Make America Healthy Again. So I've thought about this. I'm a trained epidemiologist, meaning I study the distribution and determinants of chronic diseases. And I've thought about Make America Healthy Again. And in order to analyze that, I had to divide it into adults and children. Let's take the adults first. Were adults really healthier back in 1970? 1960? I agree with you. No. The answer is no. And I think the single greatest detriment to human health that was predominant at that time was smoking. It's clear. I mean, the evidence is in on smoking that it's just bad for you. It's a bad thing to do. I think everyone recognizes that. But let me tell you what, 1920, 1930, 1940, no, people didn't recognize that. Doctors didn't recognize that. Doctors smoked while making rounds in the hospital, in the operating room, performing autopsies. Doctors and nurses advertised cigarettes. And when Rose and Sir Austin Bradford Hill presented to the Medical Research Council in 1949 conclusive evidence based on their observations that smoking caused lung cancer, the medical community didn't turn on a dime. They didn't say, oh, well, thank you, we need to stop smoking. No, people rejected those findings. That was 1949. It went all the way until 1964, and Surgeon General Luther Terry presented the Surgeon General report on smoking. And he called in the major chiefs of medicine, the major players in medicine. And you can watch the video of this. You should see how pale and nauseated these doctors looked when Terry was reviewing the data on how bad this was. Because it was personal. It was personal to the doctors who smoked. It was personal to the nurses. They can't believe they had done this to themselves. In The Emperor of All Maladies, a book written by Mukherjee, who is a Dana-Farber Cancer Institute fellow. And by the way, it won its Pulitzer Prize as his first book, so it's a really good read. He describes the lead lung surgeon at Johns Hopkins who was taking out lung tumor after lung tumor. And if you've ever seen these tumors, they tend to be blackened and grayish. And the surgeon himself was smoking all the time while he was taking out these lung cancers. And he absolutely and vehemently denied any linkage between smoking and the lung cancers he was taking out. He ultimately died of lung cancer himself. So in the healthcare professional field, when it's personal and when people have engaged in it themselves, it becomes nearly impossible to be objective. And this is true about anything. Once somebody has the problem, in this case, a giant health risk, smoking, and which is, terribly addictive, they have a problem. And the medical community had a giant problem. By studying old films in 1920, the estimates were 80% of the adult population smoked. 1970, we have very good data, 1970, and I remember that. Who remembers people smoking on airplanes? Sure, smoking in church, smoking in Congress, smoking in schools. 1970, 50% of the US population smoked. We get into the 1980s, we got up to 1 million heart bypass surgeries per year. Nearly 1 million coronary angioplasties. There were heart blockages everywhere. You heard about CEOs having cardiac arrests in the boardroom. The current point prevalence of smoking is 17% and going down. 1970, the number of people who would run a marathon as a personal goal, that number was about 70,000 people would run a marathon. It wasn't very popular. We really didn't have running shoes back then. Current number of marathon completers in the United States, over 1 million. Over 1 million. Almost every person in my family or who I've taken care of as a patient who has lived to over age 80 has never jogged a mile in their adult life, has never done a push-up, has never done a sit-up, has never made a dietary choice that they thought was particularly healthy. They got there out of good fortune. Good fortune. So I don't think adults were healthier than they are now. I really don't. So Make America Healthy Again, I don't think applies to adults. What do we have to look forward as adults? I'll get to the children in a minute. If we were to cast a forecast for each one of us and say, what's going to be our end? Well, it would be 40% would be heart disease, so blockages of the arteries to the heart, a valve problem, heart failure, or a stroke. 40% would be cancer, and some of you know relatives or friends or others who ultimately succumb to a cancer. And then 20% would be due to other causes, something else, homicide, suicide, car accident, some other, calamity that strikes. So if we were to look at that and said, I want to feel good, I want to be healthy and function really well, and I want to survive a long time. You want all three of the FDA claims. Then you would start to look at that pie, that 40-40-20 pie, and say, what can I do? What can I do so I don't end up with a heart attack and a cardiac arrest? Well, we covered smoking. That's pretty solid. We won't smoke. Many of you have never smoked a cigarette in your adult life. So you're on a very different trajectory than a lot of your relatives. My father lived to age 83, and he was a chain smoker. I remember, as a kid, just being in a house cooped up in the smoke and the smoke in the car. It was everywhere all the time. That chain smoking, pack after pack after pack. Some of you remember chain smokers. Smoking is a big time risk factor for coronary atherosclerosis and heart blockages, for sure. Okay. Another one is diabetes, type 2 diabetes. When I first started practice, late 1980s, the rate of diabetes, type 2 diabetes in a medical practice would probably be under 5%. The rate of obesity was under 10%. Now we clearly have rates of obesity well past 50%, overweight up to 70 or 80%, and of course diabetes now on a graduated increased scale. Most medical practices, it could be 20 or 30% with type 2 diabetes. So type 2 diabetes, the adult form of diabetes, which is the vast majority of it, is very tightly related to weight. And the diabetes itself is a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. It's a risk factor for all kinds of problems, eye damage, kidney damage, nerve damage. Largely avoidable if one maintains very tightly a healthy body weight. Now, one of the large federally funded epidemiologic studies examined this. And they examined weight trajectory. 90% of people, their weight has escalated beyond graduation of high school. So think back to your high school senior weight and think where you are now. Have you advanced or have you kept it within a range? People say, well, doc, what's an acceptable range? I'd say probably 10 pounds, maybe 15 at the most. If you've kept your weight in range, you're very, very unlikely to develop type 2 diabetes. So one can actually handle that pretty well. Another major risk factor is blood pressure, elevation in blood pressure. That's tougher. Right now, about 65% of adults age 65 and above have high blood pressure by measurement. And there are a few lifestyle things that can bring blood pressure down. I wish I had, that type of blood pressure, but I don't. I've personally been on blood pressure medicine since I've been about age 25. I'm 63 right now, so you can imagine I've been on blood pressure medicine much longer than I have not been on blood pressure medicine. But my family's from Ireland, and when my dad and I went back and examined how long people lived in my family, all the men were dead in their 40s, largely because of stroke or heart failure, which is a product of untreated high blood pressure. Many remember the fate of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, where essentially just blood pressure just blew out his brain in the end. So treatment of blood pressure has been in advance, and many of us will take a blood pressure medicine because we want to feel better, function better, and survive better. The last thing I want to do is wake up paralyzed on one side with a stroke or in heart failure because I've ignored my blood pressure. Another major risk factor for heart blockages is cholesterol. But this one is trickier because cholesterol in some people doesn't seem to block the arteries, and in others it does. So it's not a simple call about an elevated blood cholesterol or a normal cholesterol. In fact, there is no such thing as a normal cholesterol. Everyone has a cholesterol value in range. There are some genetic illnesses like familial hypercholesterolemia, where it's predictable that the blockages will occur. But what we're learning over time, in the absence of smoking, is we probably have a much greater lateral ability to interpret and tolerate cholesterol as a measurement in the human body. The single greatest determinant of blood cholesterol is the saturated fat intake in the human diet. Far more than eating cholesterol itself, the major source of cholesterol being eggs or liver. Another major risk factor is our family history. We do have to pay attention to that. If your father or mother had heart blockages and needed bypass surgery at a young age, a woman before the age of 55, a man before the age of 45, those are the American Heart Association definitions. And then it happened in your brothers and sisters, boy, you ought to pay attention because it's likely going to happen in you, and it's likely driven by familial tendencies. Very good genetic analysis have been done, and the conclusion is that about 50% of the explanation of heart blockages is based on these traditional risk factors, and the other 50% is still factors we don't yet understand. So for many, it's still a mystery. Doc, why did I need a bypass surgery? I did everything right. Well, it's not all completely explained based on the current understanding of risk factors. But if we look broadly at heart disease, a paper from UCLA years ago, Greg Fonerow was the first author, it's called the UCLA CHAMP study. It estimated that 95% of heart problems could be managed with lifestyle, healthy diet, exercise, avoiding smoking, avoiding diabetes, perfectly managing everything. So heart disease, of that 40%, is manageable. So we've heard about heart-healthy diets and all kinds of things to do to make sure that we're healthy from a cardiovascular perspective. That's terrific. Probably the single greatest thing of that entire domain is weight. And so everybody has their own brief dietary advice on weight. I'll tell you what mine is. Now, I'm not a vegan Adventist, okay, but I'm not a carnivore either. And on my podcast, McCullough Report on America Out Loud, I've had on my show several times Dr. Joel Kahn from Michigan, who was a mentor of mine at William Beaumont Hospital. And he probably knows the data on diet and heart disease the best. He's published a book on this, the plant-based approach. And Joel's analysis is about 98% of the dietary published studies favor a plant-based approach, and about 2% are on the side of this idea of more carnivore, more meat intake. So, most of my Adventist friends are on the vegetarian side of the continuum, and I am probably about 90% of the time. But my brief dietary advice to patients, and most patients, and most individuals in general, would like to accomplish a few goals with their body. They'd want to lose weight for aesthetic reasons. They would want to prevent diabetes, prevent heart disease, prevent kidney disease, have less stress on their joints. The leading determinant for a hip or knee replacement, by the way, is excess weight. It's not exercising too much. And so they'd want to lose some weight. In order to do that, there are two components to diet. This is my brief dietary advice. Healthy choices and portion control, and you have to have both. People say, well, Doc, I made lots of healthy choices, but I kept going back for more and more and more. It's like, no, it doesn't work that way. It's healthy choices and portion control. And portion control means reconnecting with hunger. Hunger is a normal sensation. It's okay to feel hungry. It's actually kind of good to feel hungry. Every study ever done has demonstrated that periods of time with no food or fasting has amazingly favorable effects on cellular function in the human body. Virtually every major religion in the world, in the history of the world, has had fasting as some part of its doctrine. So healthy choices, in brief, in my view, are choosing high-quality sources of protein plus fresh fruits and vegetables. And if you are a vegetarian or a vegan or a pescatarian, it largely means, choosing your protein sources from the ones you choose, but at the top would be fish. So fish, beans, nuts, egg whites, non-fat dairy, occasional chicken and beef, occasional. I mean very occasional. For many of you, it's never, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine. I've personally taken pork out of my diet in recent years with the discovery that genetic vaccines are being used in pork, and it's not a particularly healthy source of meat anyway. So for many, pork is out. So high-quality sources of protein, fresh fruits and vegetables. What does that leave out? It leaves out a lot of caloric sources. The 3 S's: sugars, starches, and saturated fat. Sugars are easy, sweets and treats and candy bars. There's some back here where the speakers are, by the way. I've already seen them. The bowl is nearly empty. Starches is the big one. Starches are foods made out of flour, rice, and potatoes. By and large, starch is sugar molecules linked together. And I know this goes back a long way. People talk about breaking bread and what have you. Well, when we were very calorically restricted, it's possible for people in Southeast Asia to live on a rice-based diet. It's possible in a very extremely calorically restricted way. It's possible that people, let's say out of the Middle East, for instance, who've eaten pita bread for centuries and the millennia, calorically restricted could be thin. But for most everybody else, starch in the diet means weight that just is accumulating. About 60% of the calories in the American diet is starch. You know it, bread and cookies and bagels and chips, and it just keeps going and going and going. You don't need it. Has no essential fatty acids, no essential amino acids, not a good source of fiber. Don't need it. If you never ate another crumb of bread in your life, you'd be better off for it. Okay, and then saturated fat. Saturated fat is the fat that directly causes heart blockages. It's largely in animal fats, like hamburger grease, bacon, but also cheesecake, milk, cream. When I was a kid growing up, one of the first jobs I had was in a nursing home that was right around the block from where I lived. And this is Texas, and this is a long time ago. But the single most desired drink of someone in this nursing home was buttermilk. Anybody remember buttermilk? I don't think you can find that anymore in the store. Buttermilk was this thick, gloppy, it was thicker than cream. It was nearly 100% saturated fat. But as a general rule, if you were to navigate and people say, well, doc, I've got to have something, I'd say, well, keep the saturated fat less than 10 grams a day. Less than 10 grams a day. So let me give you an interpretive framework. So I'm just a typical American. I had a couple cups of coffee this morning, and I had some half and half in it. 2 grams of saturated fat so far. I'm going to have lunch with you here. I'll take a look at it, but I bet it'll be under 4 grams of saturated fat. And then if dinner tonight is something healthy, let's say salmon salad or what have you, it'd be another 2 or 3 grams of saturated fat. I'll easily make it under 10 grams, easily. But if I went out for a Whataburger and fries, that's 60 grams of saturated fat. Or how about a Cheesecake Factory cheesecake? That can be upwards of 100 grams of saturated fat, 10 times what you'd want to take in. So that's healthy choices. Portion control is keeping the portions sufficiently low enough where you should be hungry going into that next meal. Shouldn't go from meal to meal to meal and have no hunger. Sometimes I'll have very heavy patients in the office, and I'll ask them, when was the last time you were hungry? Really hungry? And they say, Doc, I haven't been hungry for years. It's because it's just too much. It's too much. Hunger is a pretty good indicator. That hunger started to come back, and your body does adjust to hunger. It does. It auto-adjusts. I haven't had anything to eat today so far, and my body is adjusted to hunger. I was a little bit stronger an hour or two ago, but it's very manageable right now. Okay, so that's the cardiovascular side of chronic disease. What about cancer? Is there such a thing as an anti-cancer diet? The answer is yes, but it's much more nuanced. Recently, I had on my show, I think one of the brightest naturopathic doctors I've had a chance to interview. His name is Michael Gaeta. If you ever have a chance to get him, I'd highly recommend him. But he reviewed all of the culinary herbs and vegetables where there are data supporting the fact that they are anti-cancer. When I mean anti-cancer, they probably do bolster the body's own immune defenses in recognizing cancer cells or nascent cancer cells and snuffing them out before a full cancer develops. And this is a really fun topic. I am not an expert on it, but we reviewed several of these. One of them is curcumin, derived from turmeric. Who puts turmeric on their diet? Yeah, that's the orange stuff. That is anti-cancer, and there's plenty of data to support it. The Asian Indians in India eat about 2,000 milligrams a day. Most of us probably are well below 500 in our diet, but they do have lower rates of some cancers in India. It's very, very interesting. What else can we do in terms of cancer? Well, we avoid smoking for sure. Do you know our outgoing Surgeon General just wanted warnings on the packaging of alcohol for being a cancer risk factor? And it is. Alcohol is a risk for head and neck, esophageal, and stomach cancer, for sure. How else can we avoid cancer? Well, skin cancer is related to sunshine and ionizing radiation, so that's something that we've been able to manage. And then outside of that, there's just a few cancers that we can even proactively screen for. So a woman can undergo screening for breast cancer through a variety of methods now, not just mammography, and then ovary and uterus cancers through routine exams. And there's a cancer window for most of us, and it's up to age 75. And you know, the guidelines say that after we get past 75, we can stop doing these at this point in time. So the cancer window when things really pop is in those middle years. For men, it's largely prostate. And we have a blood test and physical exam for that, and ultrasound if needed, biopsies. And then for both men and women, colon cancer, and then colonoscopy. So having a routine colonoscopy. That's the one cancer screening test that's also therapeutic, because if a polyp is found, it can actually be snipped out right then and there, and you can be spared the cancer. So the colonoscopy. So that's heart disease, the 40%, cancer, the 40%. Now we're down to 20% other causes. A lot of that is in the neuropsychiatric realm. It's about your health and well-being mentally. It's about, being reasonable. Are you somebody who goes bungee jumping? Are you, flying a solo airplane? Do you drive a fast car and weave in and out, or are you careful and conservative? Most Adventists I know are careful and conservative people. They're conservative. Like I'm very conservative. I just don't enjoy taking risks. I know some do. But it's very important that other 20%, most of it is manageable. Obviously, a lot of that 20% is self-inflicted. And so you'll hear stories of someone dying of alcoholism, and it's possible to die that way, or alcoholic liver disease, or dying of a drug overdose. And I am amazed when I do a family history of a mother and father who seem very reasonable, and they have 3 very reasonable and successful children, but they have a 4th who is completely different and who's a drug addict on the street, lost. In fact, one of my patients, I was taking a family history, she said, yeah, my son died last year, and he was that lost sheep. He, no matter what the family did, he couldn't be retrieved. He was so deep into drug addiction and psychiatric illness. He was one of those homeless people on the side of the road, or actually on the median. You know how they get on the median and they're asking? And one day he just rolled off the median and the car didn't see him and just ran over him. And that was it. But that would be in the 20% of other causes. So I would say all of us are in the business in Make America Healthier. If we're adults, we're just going to make ourselves healthier, potentially than we are now. But we're going to have a long health span, a long lifespan. We actually have not been able to study people who have maintained high levels of fitness and excellent diets for their entire lives, free of all these other threats. Can someone really live to 120? We don't know. There are some studies of the Seventh-day Adventists that suggest they are long-lived, but we don't know with modern medicine and assistance how long we can go. Now, what about Make America Healthy Again for children? For children. Were children healthier, let's say in the 1960s and 70s? For sure. For sure. So Make America Healthy Again really applies to the children. Every study shows that. Children in the 60s and 70s, I was a child in the 60s, were clearly healthier. They had much lower rates of chronic diseases, asthma, allergic dermatitis, recurrent and upper airway infections, and sinusitis, and pharyngitis. They had much lower rates of attention deficit disorder and seizures, epilepsy, tics, autism spectrum disorder. Much lower, much lower. And this is not about smoking or alcohol. We're talking about kids. We're talking about, kids from the time of birth to age 18. They are far more ill now with chronic disease. That's the reason why this chronic disease is so important to think about. It begs the question, are we doing something to the children to make them unhealthy? Is there something, with everything we're trying to do in humanity right now, are the children becoming unhealthy? Is it a byproduct of something we're doing? Now, there are some glaring historical examples of just being on the wrong track. It happens. And in medicine, we have to find this out. And the example after example, the medical orthodoxy does not lead with the discovery that indeed an intervention is causing harm. Case in point, a product in the late 19th century, early 20th century for teething pain in babies was actually a mercury topical that would put on the gums and it would soothe the baby's teething. Mercury. How many children had massive mercury poisoning? Awful mercury poisoning with severe mental lifelong side effects. An untold amount. 1910. The single greatest and most widely used medicinal product in medicine, the first products of Pfizer and Merck and Bristol Myers Squibb, cocaine. Cocaine. It was in everything. It was in Coca-Cola. Kids used to drink Coca-Cola. It was in Chianti wine. The whole country was addicted on cocaine. But fortunately, enough people woke up. It took decades to wake up, and cocaine got out of the food supply. It got out of the drug supply. But that's a great example. Mercury was taken away, so the kids weren't mercury poisoned. By the time we got to the 1950s and 60s forward, the kids were healthy. When I was a child in the 60s, the rate of autism was 1 in 10,000. Now the rate's 1 in 36 and climbing. Probably the next CDC review will be closer to 1 in 24. We're talking 2 to 3% of the population the childhood population has a neuropsychiatric disorder that's impacting their ability to communicate with others, potentially limiting their personal trajectories. Some cases are absolutely tragic, head banging and screaming 24/7. How many of you know somebody in your circle touched by autism now? Well, there you go. It's 25% of the crowd. How many of you, when you were in kindergarten, had an autistic kid in your class? No one. But one person. One person. 2. It can happen. I recently had a patient in my practice who I had for a long time. He died of heart failure, of a failing aortic valve. He was born in 1945. Okay, so he died at age 80. He had autism. He had autism. And he spoke in that robotic monotone. Do you remember that Dustin Hoffman film, Rain Man? He spoke like this. He had this kind of robotic voice, and he could recall all kinds of baseball facts. And he was a tremendously talented man in his sphere of interest and his livelihood, but he had autism. So autism is a real problem, and it goes back a long way. The question on the table is, what could be making it become so overwhelmingly common? The curve is asymptotic. If something is not done, it will be a consumptive problem for subsequent generations. There's no doubt about it. Even if a fraction of autistic individuals require additional care, education, and training, it will be consumptive for society. So something must be done. We must have an all-hands-on-deck Manhattan Project to figure out what is driving this. Well, I've examined what's in the literature on this so far. And it's going to be, I think autism is going to be like coronary heart disease. There's no single cause. Remember I told you, smoking and cholesterol and diabetes and family history and blood pressure. It's going to be multifactorial for autism, for sure. For sure. But let me give you a couple of them that are out there. Premature delivery. Now remember, before there were neonatal ICUs, some premature babies didn't make it. That was a 3rd trimester death, but many of them make it now. So delivery before 37 weeks is a risk factor. Older parents is a risk factor, and we all know older parents are deciding to have children later in life. Siblings with autism. Okay, so there is probably a genetic predisposition. You'd be disappointed to see the genetic studies to get exactly what types of genetic loci or polymorphisms play a role, but probably genetics play a role. But genetics don't change that much over time. The genetics cannot change from 1960 to 2025 that quickly. But genetics will play a role, for sure. Another clue is a febrile seizure during childhood. There's a paper by Nichols and colleagues in Europe that's striking. If a child under age 5, I believe in that analysis, had a febrile seizure, had a severe enough fever to trigger an epileptic seizure, a generalized tonic-clonic seizure, there was a 40% chance that child would convert to autism. That is a striking observation. So what are the things that can cause a child to have a febrile seizure? It can be severe infections, for sure, and kids are having more and more upper respiratory infections. That's proven. Another is giving multiple vaccines all at once to a child. It can cause a reaction. It happens. It happens. And so Andrew Wakefield, a gastroenterologist in London at the time, published in 1998 an observation that parents reported to him that indeed with the measles, mumps, and rubella vaccine, that some children did get sick, they had an acute reaction, and to the parents' observation, they converted to autism. This paper probably has garnered more attention than virtually any other manuscript in modern history. It was published in Lancet. It's one of the better medical journals I've published in Lancet in the world. It's like the New England Journal of Medicine of England. And it was a valid paper for over 10 years. But there was just relentless pressure put on the journal and the co-authors to ultimately have the journal retracted. And Wakefield was discredited. He was so-called debunked. Similar to how the early doctors who observed smoking and the risks for lung cancer were debunked. Wakefield also noticed that there were changes in the children in the lymph nodes in the GI tract area, lymphoid hyperplasia. As we sit here today now, there's probably 200 peer-reviewed manuscripts showing that autism is somehow related to the immune system and a sudden change in the brain in childhood. The children in general are not born with autism. They're normal, and then they convert to autism typically before the age of 5. So there is an abnormal immune response that plays a role. 200 papers show that. We have the converse now in 6 manuscripts. The converse would be, what if children take no vaccines at all? None. None. There are some religious sects, the Amish, Mennonites, and others based on philosophical or other reasons take no vaccines whatsoever. The most recent paper is by the first author is Anthony Mawson. It's published in the Journal of Public Health Science, Policy, and the Law, but it's an important paper to examine. 49,000 children in the Florida Medicaid program, 49,000 children at age 9. And Mawson looked back at the Medicaid records, which are available, and asked the question, how many visits did they have for vaccination covered by Medicaid? It's a fair question. He found about 10% of the children had no Medicaid visits for vaccines. Now, maybe they got a vaccine at a school campaign or what have you, but it's a reasonable proxy for either an unvaccinated group of children or lightly vaccinated, okay? The rate of autism in the group of children who were in that group where they had no Medicaid visits for vaccines was 1.1%. 1.1%. So just over 1 in 100. The rate of autism in the children who were by proxy fully vaccinated, 2.9%. Nearly a threefold difference. And then he examined how many shots? Well, the kids who had the most visits for shots had the highest risk of autism. How about related conditions like seizures and tics and attention deficit disorder? Well, yes, it was all related. And this is the 6th paper that has suggested this. So recently we saw a lot of theater in Congress as Robert F. Kennedy was going through his confirmation process, and then Jay Bhattacharya and Marty Makary and Maggie Hassan from New Hampshire was holding up a pile. She goes, vaccines don't cause autism. Case closed. Well, how does she know? How does she know? Well, Bernie Sanders said the same thing. And, and a senator from Bill Cassidy, a gastroenterologist from Louisiana, said the same thing. That it's case closed. Vaccines don't cause autism. Sanjay Gupta was on with Anderson Cooper during the deliberations, and he said, can you believe that Robert F. Kennedy has suggested that vaccines are linked to autism? And Gupta looks straight at the camera and says, we don't know what causes autism, but it's not the vaccines. If we don't know what causes, if we don't causally understand a disease, we certainly can't rule anything out as more and more manuscripts are submitted. So I think that autism and neuropsychiatric diseases and these childhood diseases could be a product of what's happened to the children, where now between the ages of 12 and 15 months, by the schedule, they get 16 different injected products, many of them in close combinations with one another. So the measles, mumps, and rubella is also now combined with the chickenpox, for instance. Okay, those are all what's called live attenuated vaccines. And so, as a general principle, vaccines should be nothing different than an antibiotic or a blood pressure medicine or a cholesterol medicine. They're tools that we use in clinical practice. We don't go up to one another and say, do you believe in calcium channel blockers? No, I use them as to treat blood pressure or atrial fibrillation. But yet with vaccines, people say, do you believe in vaccines? Are you anti-vax? Are you pro-vax? You know something's wrong when vaccines are set up in this type of tight political division. You know something's wrong, right? That can't be right. We can't look at blood pressure medicines and be indifferent and be objective, but on vaccines be completely subjective and lack all discipline in our thinking. They must be evaluated. No product in medicine is 100% safe. No product is. And no product in medicine should be universally applied to every human being on the planet. It can't be that way. It can't be. It can't be. Neuropsychiatric disorders are a striking change from the 1960s to 2025. But let me give you another one. How many of you as a kid ate peanut butter and jelly sandwiches? How many of you remember flying on Southwest Airlines, I just flew today, where they handed out peanuts? Never again. We can't even have a peanut in elementary school today or on an airplane flight because peanut allergies are so severe and so common, and other nut allergies. Food allergies are through the roof. Something is going on. Maybe it's something in how it's presented in the diet, or maybe it's our trace amounts of peanut oils in vaccines or other products. I don't know, but it should be investigated. These are striking changes we've seen before our very eyes with our children. So I think Robert F. Kennedy is right. We do need to make America healthy again for our children, and we need a fair, unbiased examination of all of these factors to give our children the best chance. They're not going to have the same chance as we are. Kids emerging with diabetes and obesity and asthma, food allergies, neuropsychiatric problems, they're not going to have the same trajectory that you and I have. For the first time, we may see generational change slide with respect to chronic diseases. So I think now is a time of reflection. It's a real wake-up call for all of us. I hope all of us can think about this and be tolerant of discussions with one another on this. The Adventists are way ahead of so many of my other friends in terms of natural approaches, making the best choices, going natural first, and integrating this as part of your entire holistic approach to the way you live life. I'm Dr. Peter McCullough. Thank you so much for having me. It's been great to be with you. Thank you. Thank you.